I moved from San Diego to Hollywood in the summer of 1978. I knew of bands who were looking for a drummer, so I quit failing in college and moved to LA. My first band was Audio Vidiot, which included our host, Marina Del Rey. After we played together a few months, there was a split in the band. The punk half kept the name, eventually taking our fans' advice and shortening it to the Vidiots. The other half, next wave members, became Viva Beat. The Vidiots played gigs with other second wave post-Mask Club bands, opening up for some of the more established punk acts. The three original members, Robert, David, and I, played with a succession of bass players, occasionally including Alex's brother David, who was the guitarist in Viva Beat. All right, did I say David's brother Alex? Okay. My head's playing games. One of those various bass players, Robert Bryan, never trust a guy with the first name as his last name, was drumming with the new band that he was not into, so he asked me to go to the rehearsal in his place. The band was fronted by Phast Phreddie, who was a writer for Backdoor Man and Slash magazines, and a DJ at the fabulous Starwood nightclub. So this was too cool for me to pass up. I showed up at the Bargain rehearsal studio with my drums, introduced myself to Phreddie. He plied me with malt liquor and pointed out the players in the room. Don Snowden, the LA Times music critic, was on bass. Jeffrey Lee Pierce, another Slash writer, was sitting at the piano. Future Blasters and Los Lobos sax player Steve Berlin and a guy named Harlan on guitar. I'd call that good company. That's a wonderful guy. We started off playing Night Train, the old 12-bar blues standard, which I'd played in my school stage band. They had a hard time finding a drummer that knew how to swing, and they were impressed with me. I was able to pick up the drinking songs that were in their repertoire, thanks to my drumming in San Diego keg party bands. We got drunk and jammed till the studio closed, and I was asked back. I worked the two-band deal for a while between the Vidiots and Precisions, and while I had been driving a truck for a Hollywood international freight forwarder who had accounts with film studios and record labels back in the analog era before thumb drives, when those heavy hexagonal film cans needed to be shipped overseas for the new movie releases. For new records, we would ship these things called stereo mothers, which were gold-tinted metallic LP-sized discs that were necessary to press vinyl in Paris or Kuala Lumpur, also with the color-coded slicks for the record jackets. I would pick up the materials, pack them up at the shop, and drive them to LAX Cargo or the ports. My boss was a tyrant and yelled a lot, but it was a good job, and I learned how to navigate the streets of LA. One of the labels I visited was called Areola, and that's where Marina worked. It felt like every time I was there, they would be blasting that label's bombastic monster hit, the disco version of Knock on Wood. That's pretty much, that was it. One evening, I met my friends Jordan and AJ. The latter was done with his shift at Budget Rent Car in an old two-story horseshoe-shaped castle at the corner of Wilshire and Veteran in Westwood. There was a bar in the building called the Who's Who, where we enjoyed a few beers. The bartender, Benefield, was also the building manager. He told us the history of the Who's Who, built in the 1930s as the Barbizon School of Modeling for Women, designed after the Swiss Chateau. There was a small swimming pool and patio in the center of the horseshoe that looked out on the federal building across the street. Okay, this is the way the building looked in the old days. One of my lodge members had replaced where it said Barbizon School. He put the Water Buffalo Lodge there. So go ahead and pass that around. And then on the other side is the way it looked at the end with the Marlboro sign hovering over it. And that's another story I'll tell another time. But anyhow, federal building. The building was gorgeously old and worn, destined for the wrecking ball. Nothing lasts in LA. I checked out one of the units, a basic single with a bathroom and a closet. Some of the renters were vets with the LA VA hospital nearby. The others were UCLA students. I asked Benefield about any rooms for rent, and he said that he would need to clean some junk out of a unit. AJ told me that the car rental office there needed a hiker who would prep the cars and pick up customers. AJ set me up with an interview. I walked into the car rental office, which looked like a 1970s porn shoot. Wormwood paneling, cork tiles, and gold vein mirror tiles were on 3 of the walls, and with the window that looked out onto the rent me cars in the front lot. I met the manager, Steve, a red-faced, curly-haired, middle-aged guy inhaling an all-American hickory burger. I don't know if you remember them. On the front desk. No forms to fill out. I just had to work 11 to 6, 5 days a week. Perfect. Not too early for the late night gigs and not too late for sound checks. Attire was a t-shirt and jeans, an oil rag and screwdriver hanging out the back pocket. Sounded awesome. I went back to my old boss and told my old job to tell my boss the news. The car rental job was cool, but the daily drive between Hollywood and Westwood was torture. After much pestering, Benefield finally cleared out a room, and the move west was on. This was also part of the drift away from the Vidiots toward Phast and the Precisions, who were getting a lot of the in-crowd gigs, while the punk scene was getting younger and more violent. The Hollywood punk bands were being pushed aside by the OC and South Bay hardcore bands. We all remember that, right? My room was on the first floor, facing the massive high-rise parking structure next door, not the pool or the street. The room received little sunlight, which was a plus for me. The darker and cooler, the better, except for when an annoying car alarm would go off. The West Side living was posh. I would walk up the hall to the car rental office, head over to the Who's Who bars after work, lounge around the pool, or walk into the village for a fat burger, the Double King chili cheese egg burger on the char. I would have barbecues on warm Sunday afternoons. UCLA and music friends would stop by, fall in love with the place, and ask about renting a room as well. I had a budding poobah done. That's another story for another time. There was one precision show that was memorable, not for the show itself, but what happens afterwards. It was a Top Jimmy and the Rhythm Pigs gig with the Precisions, and that's another story for another time. And it was at Dylan's Disco in Westwood. By early 1982, the disco fad had waned, and the club was booking live bands to stay afloat. I just recently asked Phreddie to help me fill in a few details on the night, and this is what he said. Yeah, I remember that night with Lester Bangs. He called me to tell me he was in town working on some book project that I don't think happened. I told him about the Precisions gig last night, but he said he had plans to hang out with Richard Meltzer. Then he called back to say Meltzer canceled and he wanted to go to the gig. So I drove out to the valley where he was staying with his brother, and picked him up. Richard Meltzer is a renowned rock critic and writer. He wrote several songs for Blue Oyster Cult, including Don't Feel the Reaper. But this isn't about him. It's about Lester Bangs, who, to quote his biographer, was a great gonzo journalist, gutter poet, and visionary rock writer. It's Hunter Thompson, rock writing's Hunter Thompson, Charles Bukowski, and Jack Kerouac all rolled into one. Here's a couple of pictures of Lester Bangs. And we turn the page. I couldn't decide whether to staple them or not. But I did. If you have seen Cameron Crowe's film Almost Famous, Lester is portrayed by Philip Seymour Hoffman, who encourages the film's protagonist to pursue his dreams as a rock writer. I knew about Lester Bangs in my teens through his writings in the great rock mag Cream, as well as the less revered Rolling Stone. He later wrote for Village Voice, Penthouse, Playboy, and NME. Heard about those earlier. Lester enjoyed the gig, our band, and wanted to hang out after. So after I loaded my drums in my huge white Hawaii 5.0 1969 Mercury Monterey sedan, I gathered up some cash from the gang and stopped by the local Smith's Food Kit to pick up some supplies while Lester and the physicians wandered through the village over to the Who's Who. When I arrived home, they were all waiting in the hall outside my door. We brought in my drums, the beer, and the chips and settled in. I had set up a stereo in my room and with my record collection in the large walk-in closet, well stocked by my pals at the Rhino record store nearby. Lester started rifling through the records, carelessly slapping them on the phonograph, either praising or degrading the song's contents, yanking them off and stacking them to one side, and moving on to the next. He thought Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music was one of the great all-time records. Luckily, he spared us from listening to it that night. I've always been a big fan of used film soundtrack LPs. They offer a glimpse into musicians and bands I might not normally listen to. Lester was making his way through the soundtracks when one in particular caught his eye. It was Quincy Jones' soundtrack to Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. I usually would listen to this when I was in one of my rare pensive moods. Lester's mood changed once he put on that LP. He moved away from talking about songs and bands to telling stories of his life. I wish I could recall all the specific stories, but we had a room full of musicians and writers wrapped in his storytelling. The evening was one long stream of consciousness coming from Lester, his youth being raised by Jehovah's Witnesses' mom, who tried to shield him from the evils of wild music, surreal books, and hard drugs, all of which ended up being the essentials of his lifestyle, the fuel for his writing engine. He wanted to have as many unusual experiences as possible in his life. He flipped over to side 2 in Cold Blood, talked about how disappointing the Haight-Ashbury scene was. Just a bunch of sheep following a trend. He preferred the riotous revolution that was going on in Detroit at the same time. Thelonious Monk changed his life. Flipped to side A. This went on all night, Lester answering questions with stories, talking about important people in his life, all with the Quincy Jones masterpiece as his soundtrack. He was brilliantly entertaining, self-admittingly full of shit. One by one, the band members fell asleep until we all passed out. We were awakened to the sound of Sunday morning coming down. Not the song, the reality. Everybody went their own way. Shockingly, Lester died a month or so later in New York City, self-medicating the flu with codeine, benzos, and NyQuil. That'll get you every time. He was 33. There was a Human League album playing over and over on his turntable. Yikes. The film critic Roger Ebert wrote of his passing, Lester Bangs lived fast, died young, and left a beautiful body of work. He was one of the few critics whose work was worth reading itself apart from its subjects. Thank you for indulging me.